Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode of Makeup and Wake Up. Today's episode is episode number 10. There is always a link down below to the playlist if you happen to miss one of the last 9 episodes of Makeup and Wake Up. But this week's episode is going to be a focus on microaggressions. So in light of recent events and movements that are going on in this country and all over the world, more and more people are having discussions about race and identity and power and policing. And these conversations can be really challenging for people to have because people are realizing that their language can be really harmful towards different groups of people. But because these conversations are hard to have, that really shows you just how important they are to actually be talking about. So a microaggression is described as a subtle everyday interaction or behavior that people do that communicate some sort of bias towards historically marginalized groups. So you might be thinking, well, that just sounds like flat out racism. The difference between microaggressions and just flat out racism is that the people that commit microaggressions might not even know that what they're saying is harmful and racist. A lot of the time, this is just a result of subconscious bias. One example of a microaggression would be looking at an Asian American and commenting on how well they speak English, and that's sort of just you assuming that they weren't born here. Another example of a microaggression would be holding your purse a little bit tighter when you see a man of color, or moving away from someone on an elevator because your subconscious bias is telling you that that person is dangerous. A lot of the times people don't even realize what they're doing are microaggressions, and if you were to ask them why they said that or why they did that, oftentimes those people might get defensive or deny what they were doing because they don't realize that what they're doing is blatantly racist. Some other examples of microaggressions might be telling someone of color that they are so articulate, or telling a transgendered person that they don't look transgendered, realizing that someone you know is gay and then suggesting that they should meet your other gay friend, asking people where they're really from, assuming they're not from the country in which you're standing in right now, and also asking people about their hair and asking if it's their real hair. And if you're sitting here wondering like, oh, well, what should I be saying instead? Probably nothing. You probably don't need to be commenting on someone's hair, asking if it's their real hair, or making a comment that someone doesn't look transgendered when they're transgendered. A lot of the times the microaggressions that are said don't need to be reworded, they just don't need to be brought up. So let's talk about microaggressions towards Indigenous people. So because there's a lot of misinformation on Indigenous people and a lot of people have very limited knowledge on Indigenous people, that makes them one of the most misunderstood groups in the United States. Common stereotypes of Indigenous people are thinking that they all have black hair and tan skin and brown eyes, also thinking that they all have Indian names, thinking that Indigenous people get a free ride from the government. Meanwhile, thousands of our Indigenous people don't even have access to essentials. Another common stereotype is thinking that all natives are confined to reservations and living in teepees, wearing their hair in braids, and riding horses. These are just some examples of how our Indigenous people are stereotyped. And all of these stereotypes are a form of microaggressions, and by stereotyping and generalizing, you're not only being super disrespectful, but you're also being very harmful. Whether it's a racist sports team, harmful language, or cultural appropriation, our Indigenous people face some of the most microaggressions in our country. Just for starters, everyone needs to be more mindful of the fact that it's not Native American. In the United States, kids are taught at a very young age that we refer to our Indigenous people as Native Americans, but we need to stop that hurtful language. It is either Indigenous or Natives. The people who are Indigenous to this land were here long before the title America or American was even created. Here are just some other examples of things that people need to stop doing and saying. People need to stop saying someone or something is their spirit animal. Spirit animals, spirit helpers, animal guides, these are all examples of spiritual terminology used in Indigenous communities, and within the Indigenous cultures, these terms are often used to describe something sacred or religious. It is not used to describe something that you relate to. Something is not your spiritual animal because you relate to it. Number 2 would be calling a get-together a powwow. Powwows are significant celebrations in an Indigenous community so that people within that community and tribe can feel that sense of community. Powwows are also used by Indigenous people people to honor their heritage in a society that oftentimes marginalizes them, it is not a term to use to describe your neighborhood barbecue. Derogatory terms like Indian giver and Indian skip also need to stop. Indian giver refers to someone who gives a gift and then takes it back. This is derogatory and just flat out disrespectful, and in reality it was the US who stole land from the natives. Also, using the figure of speech low man on the totem pole. Totem poles have religious and cultural significance in a lot of tribes in the Northwest. These carvings portray stories of lineage, mythology, and also significant events, and to try to describe someone as low ranking by calling them a low man on a totem pole is extremely disrespectful. Lastly, before I say what I'm about to say, if you feel like you need to be defensive, then maybe you should reflect on that. Hanging up dream catchers and burning sage is cultural appropriation, not cultural appreciation. I spoke to my friend and subscriber Zach, and he suggested that people look into their own heritage. A lot of the times people who culturally appropriate don't know enough about their own heritage, and oftentimes those ancestors caused a lot of harm, and people like to just forget about that and dismiss it. Zach suggests to you to get in touch with your own roots, good or bad, and really do some healing and reflecting on your own lineage and really find out who you are. Let's talk about ableist language. Racist and homophobic language aren't the only ways that we see microaggression. Another form of microaggression is using ableist language. Ableist language is language that is offensive to people with disabilities, and oftentimes when people use ableist language, they are talking in a negative way. Ableism is the oppression of people with disability, and it is oftentimes expressed and enforced through ableist language. Many derogatory words for people with disabilities, like moron and idiot, began as medical definitions used to categorize people with disability as lesser humans. These terms were once really prominent in medical textbooks and scientific journals, and these terms were used to justify horrible acts towards disabled people like forced sterilization. When you describe something as being stupid or dumb or crazy, you're basically saying that people with mental or physical disabilities are less than, and that is a microaggression. Ableism is built into our language. We oftentimes grow up with this language, not thinking anything of it, and we could sit here and say, it's not my fault, but it is your job to stop doing it. Moving forward, we all need to do a better job at being more mindful of our language and thinking about the words that we use that could be ableist. I will give you some language alternatives though. Instead of saying the word crazy, try saying something is intense or silly. Instead of saying something is insane, we could say it is unreal. Instead of calling someone a psycho, you could call them a jerk. Instead of saying something is stupid or dumb, you could just call it bad. And at this point, I really hope everyone has wiped the R word out of their vocabulary. And if you ever hear someone say the R word, call them out on it. It is so inappropriate to use the R word in 2020. Here's some advice on how we can tackle microaggressions moving forward. Definitely do your own research before you approach these subjects. It is super important to be talking about and having these conversations on microaggressions, but make sure that you continue learning about these types of subjects. Read books and watch documentaries and read personal essays on people's own experiences with microaggressions. Set realistic expectations from what you want from these conversations, especially with family members. A lot of the times these conversations with family members can be really challenging to have, especially when you go into the conversation thinking that you're going to change their outlook on things overnight. Most likely you are not, and you just have to be able to recognize that and understand that people aren't going to grasp these subjects right away, and they might need time themselves to reflect on their own actions. At the end of the day, if someone is being racist, they are racist. If it hurt you or if it hurt someone else, there is no need to define it as any way other than being hurtful and racist. But it is important to understand and remember that people who engage in microaggressions oftentimes times don't even realize that what they are saying is racist or sexist or homophobic. So it is so important to call it out when you see it. Even if you're thinking, oh, they mean well, they don't know what they're saying. If they really mean well, don't you think they would want to know if what they're saying is harmful? But when calling someone out, please remember that you yourself need to also be careful and choose your words carefully, because you don't want to call someone a racist or a homophobic or a sexist because of a microaggression that they said. That oftentimes leads to arguments and people getting super defensive. You want to approach that situation with care and understanding, because people are way more receptive to that type of language and are way more willing to learn. We are all human beings and we are all prone to mistakes, and we are all human beings who commit microaggressions. That doesn't necessarily mean that you're a bad person, but that does mean that you need to be more mindful of your implicit bias and impact that your language has on other people. We need to commit to working on these types of things in order to create a more caring and harmonious society. And tackling these microaggressions within yourself and your household is a great way to get involved in the movement. Thank you guys so much for watching and listening to this week's episode on microaggressions. I cannot believe this is episode 10. Definitely make sure that you guys are subscribed and you have your notifications on for episode 11. And I will see you in 2 weeks for the next episode of Makeup and Wake Up.